moves forward from what the current conditions are.
I think more needs to be done, and more by different actors of the international community. It is very difficult for Venezuelan actors to create conditions to reverse the political situation. First of all, what they have done internationally, fragmenting the international agenda, they definitely have done it internally within the country, fragmenting the opposition and with partial agreements with all political actors. And that fragmentation of the agenda, of course, brought a lack of perspective of the real objective and the need to have a real objective, that is the redemocratization of the country. President Guaido has done what it was at his reach, but and according to the resources he has had, he did an extraordinary job. He definitely needed, and he still needs, more international support, not only in the terms of recognition, but also in practical terms that can help him in order to definitely be able with material resources to change the situation. And for that, of course, we have to understand that this country is suffering the worst humanitarian crisis ever. It has suffered the worst migration crisis ever. So mobilizing people these days in Venezuela, mobilizing the people these days in Venezuela is not so easy. Half of the people is without food or without medicines and living a miserable life. They cannot march because they don't have shoes. So that is the situation of the Venezuelan people today. We definitely need to address the humanitarian situation of the people in Venezuela. But we need to create internationally the conditions in order to have a unified agenda, as I said, that would be able to support strongly those that they have a way of moving forward in a strong way against the dictatorship. Dictatorship, they collapse under pressure. They never collapse if if you don't put pressure on them. They can last for decades. And pressure definitely is the biggest element, the biggest tool, international pressure, in order to make the life of the dictators of Venezuela miserable, and in order to be able, in that sense, to support the country. The biggest sanction, that the most cruel sanction that the Venezuelan people has suffered has been to suffer this dictatorship that created all these conditions during this time. That is definitely is an imperative for us to be able to reverse that situation. And we have to use all diplomatic and political tools available to do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your service, and thank you for joining us today. As we talk about the status of democracy in our hemisphere, we need to look at the status of good governance. And unfortunately, we have so-called democratic states that have weakness in governance that we really need to work on. Last year, the Congress passed legislation that Senator Wicker and I introduced that dealt with strengthening the parliamentary aspects of the Organization of American States, calling on a formal mechanism to involve parliamentarians in the operations of the OAS, including considering an annual forum. We used the example of the OSCE, which the Parliamentary Assembly has been very effective in promoting good governance. I just give you, by way of example, the initiation of the trafficking commitments globally to fight human trafficking, to deal with the global Magnitsky Statute came out of the Parliamentary Assembly. And many of us have participated in free and fair election observation teams that have been in country. was with Senator Portman in Ukraine as we observed elections. It gave us a much better feeling to the circumstances, and quite frankly, we're not as restrained as diplomats are in the nicety of language. We can go back and speak truth to power as to what needs to be done. Are you committed to working with us to implement greater parliamentarian participation in the OAS?
Yes, Senator, thank you very much. Yes, we are ready, and we have talked about this issue. I think it's a very important matter, and a stronger connection, stronger links of U.S. senators and Congress people with the parliaments of the Americas will be extremely helpful in order to provide stronger parliaments everywhere in the hemisphere, and of course, better capacities of these parliaments and parliamentarians. So we are ready to work together. It was a pity that COVID-19 stopped this, but as soon as normal life is restarted, I'm sure we can create conditions for a stronger participation of United States senators and congressists in order to engage better in the activities of the hemisphere and definitely create different conditions for them for their work, and that will create definitely stronger democracies.
I just point out that when parliamentarians are involved, there's a much better chance that the policies adopted by the organization will be implemented in their particular states because they go back and act and promote the policies. So it not only gives you a richer involvement to deal with the problems of our hemisphere, it also gives us a better chance to see implementation of those policies in the member states. There's a very troubling trend in our hemisphere, and that's corruption. For a hemisphere that brags about having democratic states, we lead the world in the number of states that rank the worst in fighting corruption. Venezuela is ranked 176 out of 180. Haiti's ranked 170th out of 180. Nicaragua, 159th out of 180 in their suffering from corruption. And I can mention Honduras, Guatemala, Paraguay, Dominican Republic, Mexico, Bolivia. All those are well above the world average. So my question to you, what initiatives are you pursuing within the OAS, and how can we help you in dealing with the increasing concerns about corruption which erode democratic institutions and makes it much more difficult for us to have true democracies in our hemisphere?
Thank you very much. I think we have to start with supporting governments today in order to have more transparent policies, more transparent and fair mechanisms and procedures. Current government, and of course for the welfare of the ruling leader today. So I think we have to create stronger programs and projects in order to support a cleaning inside of these governments today. E-government, transparency, more transparent governance, all that is extremely necessary and should be promoted in the hemisphere. And then to have a more able justice systems around in order to fight corruption or previous corruption, to end in the impunity of corruption. That is something that still we have moved from a certainty of impunity to a possibility of justice, but we are very far away from certainty of justice that we need to achieve in the hemisphere, and definitely it's a structural problem, structural in the political systems that you mentioned. That practically you have to reset them and restart them and making them work in a completely different manner. The way they are doing their job definitely today it doesn't work. So we need to create new capacities, and we need to provide assistance in order to rule in a different way. If they keep doing the same, I mean, you can judge them later, you can prosecute them, the same problems will keep appearing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary General, I very much appreciate your being here and appreciate your service to the OAS and to our hemispheres. And I presume that being the father of 7 qualifies you for the kind of interactions you have to have with leaders of various countries. It's not lost on you or any that watch what's happening in the world to recognize that there's a great competition going on in the world between a future that includes democracy and liberal democracy and instead an authoritarian future. And that is playing out in Latin America as it is throughout the world. As you look at what's happening in Latin America, how much of what we're seeing there is a result just of domestic passions and interests, and how much is being influenced by foreign actors? And by that I mean ourselves, the United States, Russia, China, to whether Venezuela or throughout the continents. Is this a domestic issue that we're seeing, domestic passions playing out, or is this instead being influenced to a great degree by China, Russia, and the United States? And what is our relative capacity, meaning how effective is China being compared to the United States, for instance? So I know I'm asking a lot of questions there, so I'll let you respond as you feel appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. And yes, we have structural problems in Latin America. Those structural problems is, for example, we are the most unequal continent in the world. Another structural problem is violence. We are the most violent region. We have more violent deaths than any other region in the world. We have had structural poverty of the same kind for hundreds of years. I mean, and I always put the example of my country, where we seem to be the most equal country. Uruguay seems to be the most equal country in Latin America, and still you have the same structure of poverty that 205 years ago when Artigas did the land reform of the country. That means, for example, Afro-descendants at 8% of the population, they count for 40% of poverty. Those days were widowers were children, today are single mothers that count also for a huge percentage of the poverty of the country. We have a structural poverty, structural problems that we have not been able to resolve. Other countries, of course, they are facing corruption, and that is, of course, creates awful conditions for the functioning of democracy. Organized crime, drug trafficking have created structural problems and very difficult to make elections. When you kill candidates when the candidates are killed all about, and some others resigned in order not to be killed, you see that you have there structural problems in how democracy can work. So I think we have been more efficient in destroying, the Latin Americans, we have been more efficient in destroying democracy than the international support that we have had for that. Of course, this country believes in democracy, and so they are always trying to influence the right decisions, the separation and independence of branches of government, the free press, freedom of expression, the fight against corruption. Of course, programs of security are all about the hemisphere. And some countries, they don't have that as a pattern of their political system. So, of course, they are not so interested in promoting that. whatever it is there, it may work for them, but sometimes corrupt regimes may be better in a sense that it's easy to operate. If you do illegal mining, it's easier in Venezuela than in a democratic country. If you do an ecocide, it's easier in Venezuela than in a democratic country. So even if these factors intervene, and of course, we have a regional factor, an hemispheric factor, that is Cuba, that is a dictatorship of decades, that is still there, and have worked very hard in the 60s, 70s, promoting guerrilla all about the hemisphere. Then just trying to destabilize democracies in their own way. It's a failed system. That system never worked in the world, didn't work in Central Asia, didn't work in Eastern Europe, didn't work in the Soviet Union, didn't work in Cuba, and now it's not working in Venezuela. But their political approach is always to create problems for the others, to make their problems sort of less evident. And of course, their presence in Venezuela is clear how they have influenced Venezuela to go that track. The presence of 20,000 Cubans in Venezuela is a problem. It's the biggest problem that Venezuela is facing. And if you want to have a democratic Venezuela one day, Cuba will be part of the problem and not part of the solution. I'm sorry for that. They have been part of the problem the past 18 years, 20 years. So we have to assume our faults and our shortcomings and our mischievous behavior. But of course, sometimes some have helped to go down the cliff. Thank you.
Thank you. I understand we have Senator Rounds virtually. Senator Rounds? All right. Let me move to Senator Young.
Welcome, Mr. Secretary General. It's good to have you before the committee. Your testimony today describes the work that Russia and China are doing through vaccine diplomacy. It's clear that both countries intend to use this crisis, which ironically enough emerged, it seems, from China and was certainly exacerbated by China's failure to disclose in a timely fashion the gravity and nature of this virus. We still don't have all the information. But nonetheless, it's clear that both of these countries intend to use their vaccines as a tool to accomplish a broader foreign policy set of goals and to develop inroads similar to what we've witnessed China do with its Belt and Road Initiative. In recent days, I've heard that China is providing vaccines to some countries in the Caribbean and throughout Latin America in exchange for changing their diplomatic relationship with China or recognition of Taiwan. If successful, this would be a significant shift in the People's Republic of China's favor, as a majority of Taiwan's diplomatic partners globally are in Latin America currently. So, sir, are you worried about countries receiving these vaccines with some potentially significant strings attached?
Yes. Some countries have been India, for example, has also provided donations, mainly donations to Caribbean countries, and of course, these make countries grateful because when you don't find solutions anywhere else, you find solutions wherever you can in order to vaccinate your people. So that's why I asked during my presentation for a stronger commitment of the United States of America in order to deliver. Do you have delivered vaccines to Canada and to Mexico? You have a third border that is CARICOM countries, Caribbean countries. they should be attended to, they should be taken care of too, and the rest of the hemisphere. And that is a most relevant matter today, to be close in this situation, and it is a relevant matter, and to work in a positive way in order to deliver solutions to the country of the hemisphere. It will be something that will be good for everybody. I mean, most of these countries have looked to buy these vaccines here, and that is something that have been to be taken care. I mean, they have looked here in order to buy the vaccine. So something has to be stronger. Solutions should come from here, not only for the borders, but also for the rest of the continent.
Yes, it's such a difficult challenge. As you might imagine, every country wants to ensure that their people are cared for. That's what countries do. They care for their own people, but at the same time, we have allies and partners, especially those here in our region, that we'd also like to be helpful to, in addition to providing those vaccines, which, of course, no doubt is essential. You've emphasized that. China, there again, ironically, has been the first to emerge from this pandemic, seeing as they have a better understanding of its nature, and they have an authoritarian government that can enact certain strictures that democratic governments cannot. But with that said, how else might we empower OAS to push back on these coercive practices that we've seen China utilize in exchange for vaccines?
First, we have an issue with, and sometimes I have been asking, why don't you do more about vaccines? And the thing is that we have the Pan American Health Organization that is mainly in charge. And I think the most successful way is to deliver before. That is the most successful way in order to reverse those policies, and to be able to deliver before. That is that I think should be the practice, and that should be the policy behind. Of course, sometimes it's harder because of the way that. Our regime can concentrate resources, financial, economic, material resources, is completely different than in the way democracies. But democracies have proved to be more efficient in the mid and long term. But they have to see the scenario. Of course, everybody also is concerned about itself, and it has to be something like that. It's completely understandable. Nevertheless. To be concerned about and find solution for ourselves and for itself, anyone, it is helpful to help others, and that I think should be the policy of the United States to the rest of the continent related to this matter.
Well, just for the record, I think it's wonderful that the Caribbean countries and Latin American countries are receiving vaccines. I think that's a very positive thing. And I would commend any nation for, in isolation. I support that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do want to piggyback on Senator Young's comments. Of course, we have to take care of our people in order to be healthy and therefore be able to lead. But I do agree that to the extent that we have capacity when we get beyond that, I would hope that the hemisphere will be one of the first places that we will look towards in our own national interest, to be very honest with you. Not only as a good neighbor, but because we are neighbors, we are more likely to have individuals traveling within the hemisphere, within our country and beyond. The many millions of diaspora that exist in the United States from these separate countries just creates a natural flow of people coming back and forth. And I think it's right to call China out on its coercive policies on this, which is the most heinous of all, trading. Say, I'll give you a vaccine if you do this. But they have other coercive policies that they do in terms of their investments. But by the same token, if you're suffering and you're looking for something and you've got nowhere else to go, then you maybe submit yourself to those coercive policies, as wrong as they are. And so that's why I hope the United States will get to the point to be supportive, particularly here hemispherically. I think there's many reasons for it. With that, let me recognize the chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, someone who's had a long history and very interested in the hemisphere, Senator Kaine. And I'm going to ask Senator Cardin to preside because I have a banking hearing that I just need to get a few questions in. I'll be back. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you to Chairman Menendez and Senator Risch for holding this hearing, very important hearing. I'm thrilled to be the chair together with my ranking member, Senator Rubio, on the Committee on Western Hemisphere, Human Rights, Global Democracy, Women's Empowerment. And Mr. Secretary General, I'm a big fan of yours. I really want to focus on how we can help the OAS to be effective, and I'm going to use a painful example for me, which is activities of the OAS and the United States in Honduras, where I lived in 1980 and 81. In the 2017 presidential elections in Honduras, there were huge irregularities. We want the OAS to be strong and be willing to call out problems throughout the region. We celebrate what the OAS has been willing to do, for example, with respect to Venezuela. But after the Honduran presidential election, the OAS called out the irregularities and said they were so severe that the recommendation from the OAS was that the election needed to be repeated so that those irregularities could be cured. The United States wants the OAS to be strong, but in that instance, the previous administration undercut the OAS. The OAS said the elections need to be rerun. I and other members of the committee came out in support of the OAS position. But the previous administration said, no, we're going to go ahead and recognize the new government anyway. And they recognized the reelection of President Hernandez because he had done a variety of things that the administration liked. After we recognized the reelection over the recommendation of the OAS, President Hernandez terminated a transparency initiative that was a global transparency initiative that he had embraced with some strong PR sense in his first term. Violence and corruption in Honduras spiraled downward. Immigration of Hondurans to the United States has increased because of the violence and corruption. And as members of this committee know, the president's brother, President Hernandez's brother, was convicted of drug trafficking with a lot of evidence that implicated the president. And there was just the completion of a second sizable drug trafficking case in the federal courts of New York against an associate of President Hernandez, where there was much testimony about President Hernandez's role in facilitating drug trafficking, including evidence that he had stated, we're going to shove drugs up the gringos' noses. That was some of the evidence of this president that the U.S. chose to recognize over the OAS's objections. If we want the OAS to be strong, Mr. Secretary General, and we want the OAS to be able to take tough positions, it seems to me that the U.S. should be defaulting toward trying to support the OAS in that rather than undercutting the OAS's tough decisions when they make them. Share with us how we as a Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate can help the OAS be strong in the region to counter corruption, violence, and other ills that plague us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Kaine. It's true we identified irregularities in the Honduras election. We made them public. We called for a new election. After 15 days, let's say, about 2 weeks later, started the recognitions of the new government of the government of Honduras, of the re-election of President Hernandez. So practically we were left talking alone about this matter worldwide, and definitely that we paid a huge toll, because after that the mission of to fight corruption was not renewed, and of course we had to pick up our things.
And Mr. Secretary General, when you say we paid a huge toll, we paid a huge price, you mean the OAS paid a huge price. The Honduran people paid a great price. The United States paid a great price by not striking against an authoritarian, and now we're dealing with a crisis at the border that's driven by intense violence and corruption in a country. And so if we don't act to support organizations like the OAS, we will end up seeing things that we're not happy with.
I agree with you, because bad practices have to be eradicated from the very beginning. And the Honduras political system paid a huge price. The Honduras people paid a higher price. The organization, of course, of all the prices that were paid was the lowest, we can say. We just picked up our things and we left some of the resources, material resources we are using now in El Salvador in the mission that we have there to fight.
And Mr. Secretary General, I'm over my time, and there are other colleagues who want to weigh in, but let's just finish there. By not supporting the OAS at a critical moment when you were willing to show backbone, Hondurans paid a major price. The OAS paid a price, and the United States paid a price as well. I hope we might learn that lesson. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Haggerty.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Risch, thank you very much for holding this hearing. Secretary General, it's nice to have you here today. Thank you very much. Secretary General, in the Western Hemisphere, we've seen governments use illegitimate means to change or even nullify election rules and processes related to their democratic elections. The illegitimate Maduro regime in Venezuela is the most recent example of this type of activity. For example, in May of 2018, the illegitimate Maduro regime repeatedly changed, abused, and rewrote the rules in order to hold a sham election that failed to meet any sort of international standard for fair, free, and transparent voting. And more recently, the illegitimate Maduro regime has sought to stack and manipulate in its own favor Venezuela's Federal Election Commission. Secretary General, would you agree with the general proposition that the voting public's confidence in free and fair elections, including impartial and transparent electoral processes, is necessary and critical to a well-functioning democracy?
I completely agree. It is that's the starting point of democracy.
Indeed.
For the people to be able to elect in a free way, transparent, just, and that the votes are counted properly. It's about the integrity of the electoral process. We have to see it from practically the very beginning, and we have to monitor practically every single aspect of it. Today, the challenges are big because technology keeps improving, and of course, we have to keep track with technology. At the same time, we need to be able to read adequately the political system and how it works. We observe elections, we observe facts, and we denounce those facts, and we document them, and we prove them. And those countries that they want, we can help them in order to have a better electoral process, like we are doing now in Haiti and in Honduras. It is a hard work. Sometimes it's a very demanding work. The Venezuelan case is an extreme case because, elections there are not elections at all. They don't have any pattern that is common with any election anywhere. They do fraud among them. For example, there was this election of the National Constituent Assembly, and the opposition was not participating. Nevertheless, they pumped 2 million votes in order to make one of the parties, one of Delcy Rodriguez and Cilia, defeat the other one of Diosdado Cabello. That means they cheat among themselves during the election. So that is the most extreme case that I have seen in the hemisphere so far.
Well, Secretary General, would you agree with the general proposition that a democracy risks fundamentally eroding itself when those in power change or negate election rules simply to stay in power?
I completely agree. I can sign below, definitely.
I would agree with that too. And we're witnessing happening right here in America today, at least an attempt. Secretary, what do you hope that the members of the OAS will be able to accomplish in terms of helping the Venezuelan people find their way back to democracy?
I think first we need to attend the urgent matters. The urgent matter is the humanitarian crisis, and that means we need to find mechanisms and tools in order to support the people to have food and to have medicines. That is the most urgent matter related to Venezuela. About the institutional issues in Venezuela, I suggested today that we need a unified international agenda that can help to create real pressure on the regime and move under a mechanism that can definitely make harder for Maduro to stay in power than to leave it. Till that doesn't happen, the regime will stay there. These kind of regimes, you definitely have to pump and a sustainable pressure. If not, they don't have any connection with political welfare of the people. I mean, and you can see it also with the Cuban regime, and you can see it in Venezuela. They are not responsible for what is going on with the people. If people are dying because of lack of dialysis, they don't care. Children die because they died because they didn't have vaccination of diphtheria, and they don't care. That's something that would bring down democratic governments anywhere. They don't care. They do illegal mining. They do drug trafficking. The levels of corruption are the highest ever, and they don't care. They have illegal mining. How dictatorship have illegal mining? Because they can approve whatever they want in order to do the mining in their own way. They do illegal mining because they can steal everything that they took from the mining, because they can do a complete ecocide of the system. And they are not responsible. They are not responsible about their natural resources. They are not responsible about the mineral resources. They are not responsible for their people. That means they don't have a political connection. It's a criminal gang acting in a criminal way. Until they are not completely surrounded, they will not surrender.
Thank you, Secretary General.
Thank you.
I think your response underscores the importance to deal with corruption and transparency that you've talked about before. Senator Schatz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for being here. I want to ask you about the war on drugs. Over the last several decades, we've struck a better balance in terms of our approach to combining security assistance with funding democracy programs that strengthen the judiciary, law enforcement, and civil society. But the war on drugs, in my view, is still failing our partners in the region. We're making short-term decisions to get a good headline about seizing drugs without thinking through the consequences for the people. For instance, the U.S. Coast Guard is great at closing down maritime routes and interdicting drugs that come over the water, but we see increasingly that cartels have turned instead to overland routes, clearing forests to build remote airstrips and seizing land from indigenous tribes and local communities. Too often this is done with impunity, and it shakes people's trust in the ability of the national and local governments to protect the lands. So I have a basic question for you. Is the war on drugs working? Is the war on drugs working?
It's not working in the sense that it's not delivering the results that we need in the hemisphere. And it is very easy to see. My whole budget is the whole budget of this organization, not the money that we allocate for projects related to drug prevention or fighting organized crime or drug cartels. It's less than $80 million. That is a joke in drug trafficking terms, in financial drug trafficking terms. So they are definitely not well prepared at the multilateral level in order to do so. We do projects, we encourage best practices, we help in order to develop better lives in certain communities. We have been able, in order to create better conditions for security in some communities, but overwhelmingly, drug trafficking is affecting democracy. It's killing candidates, it's forcing candidates to resign, is electing sometimes their mayors sometimes their heads of police. So it's a struggle where we are not achieving the results that we definitely owe the people to achieve.
Is it a question of our strategy being flawed, or is it a question of insufficient resources? Because it seems to me that our instinct in the Congress is always to throw more resources at interdiction, even though we've seen over the many, many years, with demand never really waning, supply finds a way north. And so I'm wondering, because I want to get clear here, you talk about the lack of resources, and the worry I would have is that then the Congress throws more resources at interdiction, which again allows us to stand next to a bunch of illegal product and claim victory when things get worse and worse in the region.
And maybe you're right. I have a view, and it's related to my own experience and what I did in the past, mainly in the days I was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Uruguay. You have to find a way to kidnap that. It's about the market. No, that's the market rules. So far, the market will keep demanding. This will keep going on, and the rest of the chain will put pressure on the rest of the chain, and we have to address how the market of drugs work in a more proper way, and to be able to kidnap part of that market with the better tools you may have, and consider the differences of the different drugs between them. And of course, be able to support people and that means a lot of things. Means security first, and how to make a living, and that is are the biggest challenge for common people, and of course. The lack of development of our country plays a major role in the problems of violence and collateral effects of the drugs that we are facing these days.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I understand that no one else. Okay. My understanding is that there's no one on either side virtually, unless I hear differently. And in the absence of hearing anyone, Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your incredibly important insights, for your generous time here. You have the thanks of Senator Risch, myself, and the committee for your service in the hemisphere. Thank you for joining us. As the Secretary departs, let me welcome to the committee Ms. Deborah Ulmer, who is the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Democratic Institute, and Mr. Ryan Berg, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ms. Ulmer has more than 20 years of experience at NDI and previously served as NDI's country director in Nicaragua and then Honduras prior to assuming her current role. She has extensive experience managing democratic assistance and human rights programming across the region. As a fellow at AEI, Mr. Berg focuses on U.S. foreign policy, national security, and development issues in Latin America and the Caribbean, and he specializes on transnational organized crime and narcotics trafficking. Prior to AEI, he served at the World Bank. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for your willingness to come share your insights. Your full statements will be included in the record. We'd ask you to limit your opening remarks to around 5 minutes, and this way we can have a conversation. Ms. Ulmer, you are recognized.
Now is this on? Yes. Thank you, Chairman Menendez and Ranking Member Risch. Thank you for this opportunity to address the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the state of democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Deborah Omer, and I'm the Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean programs at the National Democratic Institute. NDI is dedicated to strengthening democratic governance, practices, and institutions globally, and has worked in the region for nearly 35 years. Like our Republican counterparts, the International Republican Institute, NDI works with civic groups, government officials, legislators, and political parties across the political spectrum at the national and local levels on issues such as citizen security, election integrity, accountability and transparency, dialogue on political reform, and combating disinformation. Since the adoption of the Inter-American Democratic Charter almost 20 years ago, numerous challenges to democratic governments have emerged, including a rise in authoritarian leaders, an increased preference for populist leaders, challenges to electoral integrity by governments that bend the rules of the game in their favor and infuse political financing from narco-traffickers, and a growing prevalence of disinformation and illiberal influences. Honorable members of the committee, as you know, we could spend hours talking about the democratic fragility in Latin America. So in the interest of time, I would like to propose 5 areas of bipartisan engagement to help strengthen democratic governance in the region. First, the 9th Summit of the Americas provides a great opportunity to revitalize commitment to core democratic principles and respect for human rights as consecrated in the Democratic Charter. As the summit host, the United States can pursue resolutions that underscore the need to collectively safeguard human rights and free and fair elections, and promote transparency and accountability. Reaffirming these values and backing with actions will be key as illiberal countries such as Russia and China seek to expand their negative economic, political, and security role in the hemisphere. Second, in dealing with authoritarian regimes, the United States should use all of its available policy tools, including the implementation of the groundbreaking Corporate Transparency Act passed in 2020, to end corrupt actors' ability to hide stolen funds behind anonymous shell companies. Third, as is often stated, elections are an essential building block, but insufficient conditions for sustainable democracy. In NDI's experience, corrupt political dynamics are precursors to flawed elections and serve as catalysts for instability. Support for improved democratic governance in between elections is a necessary investment to promote a more stable environment. Fourth, sustained U.S. democracy in Northern Central America is necessary to improve governance, transparency, and accountability, all essential elements for development and security goals to be advanced. But accountability initiatives can only succeed when there is both internal public and international support. The United States should provide strong backing to both reformers, both inside and outside of government. I would also like to note that there is a strong desire by Central Americans for U.S. foreign policy to consider the whole region, including interlinked neighboring countries outside of the Northern Triangle. Finally, authoritarian regimes are finding more sophisticated and illiberal uses of technologies to surveil, subvert, and control their citizens. A united effort among democracies has made some progress to ensure new technologies are used to support freedom and human rights. The United States should promote the integrity of the underlying information space so authentic communications underpin the legitimacy and resilience of democracy around the world. Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, and members of the committee, thank you again for this opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Berg.
Is this on? Great. Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today on the state of democracy in Latin America and the Caribbean. As the world approached the last decade of the Soviet Union's existence and the eventual denouement of the Cold War, it seemed an inauspicious moment for the fate of democracy in the region, with military regimes still running many countries. Instead, a remarkable phenomenon transpired in the region from the mid-1980s until the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter in 2001, the longest expansion and the deepest consolidation of democracy in the region's history. The Charter enshrined the region's commitment to democracy and attempted to impel still unconsolidated democratic institutions toward further consolidation. Alas, these high-minded aspirations proved elusive in practice. The march toward a hemisphere safe for democracy was uneven and did not endure. Cuba resisted all change and continued as a communist dictatorship. Venezuela and Nicaragua succumbed to the ravages of authoritarianism. Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and more recently Brazil and Mexico were taken by the siren song of populism. Central American states failed to build on early gains and eventually suffered deep democratic backsliding. And organized crime, many times aided and abetted by the highest echelons of political power, spread its tentacles of anti-democratic corruption throughout the region. Two of the most notable trends of the past decade are the rise of hybrid regimes and authoritarian spoilers, both regional and extra-regional alike. Regionally, several countries, despite their democratic facade, are actually autocratic or authoritarian in nature. Scholars have described this hybrid regime type, where democratic institutions exist in form but not in substance, and where elections occur regularly and are largely stage-managed, as competitive authoritarianism. In addition to hybrid regimes in the region, extra-regional authoritarian actors have also stymied democratization by supporting backsliding and authoritarian governments and insulating them from democratic pressures through what we call authoritarian export and authoritarian learning. Like a family recipe, extra-regional authoritarian powers have bequeathed to several Latin American countries, namely Venezuela and Nicaragua, their best advice in regime adaptation and survival. The Inter-American Democratic Charter and traditional foreign policy tools of democracies have unfortunately proven no match for the designs of these authoritarians. In sum, the state of democracy in today's Latin America and the Caribbean may be limping instead of sprinting. Democracy may not shine as brightly as it once did, but it carries on, in desperate need of renewal and strengthening. Meanwhile, great power rivals are cheering democracy's stumbles, actively working to thwart its success, and promoting alternative systems of governance antithetical to a hemisphere safe for democracy. What are some of the lessons learned over the past 2 decades of the Inter-American Democratic Charter? First, the Charter has often failed to inspire a vision for the hemisphere of integrated and increasingly prosperous democracies. Rather, at times it has avoided slipping into irrelevance only as a coercive tool in the attempt to bring wayward countries back into line. Second, elections by themselves are not enough. As others have noted here today, this year Latin America witnesses an election supercycle with 9 countries holding elections. While the Charter helped the region maintain an admirable focus on elections, this was insufficient. A prominent Nicaraguan struggling for freedom in his country recently remarked to me, "Fraud isn't committed on the election day, but rather months in advance with manipulations of the tabulation system, voting boards, and national electoral councils." Third, the Charter is subject to and suffers from unfavorable regional dynamics, and this has vitiated the Charter's ability to serve as a policing mechanism among a community of co-equal democracies. And fourth, leadership of the OAS matters immensely. Under past Secretaries General, the Charter suffered notable defeats. Secretary General Luis Almagro deserves our high praise for elevating the Charter in the work of the Secretariat and reviving the Charter's relevance by placing it back at the center of the OAS's mission. Now, Mr. Chairman, with the brief remaining time, I would like to go through a few quick policy recommendations for the United States to forge a hemisphere safe for democracy and defeat great power rivals pushing alternative, antithetical systems of government. First, dismantle transnational organized crime networks. No amount of rhetorical fondness for the Inter-American Democratic Charter can overcome the deeply embedded networks that permeate the Western Hemisphere, emanating most startlingly from the criminal regimes in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Second, beware of the autocrat's playbook. Consolidated dictatorships are extremely difficult to dismantle, but fortunately the tools afforded to us by the Inter-American Democratic Charter can help the U.S. sound a powerful tocsin against Latin American regimes engaged in democratic backsliding before it's too late. Third, bring ideology back to the fore. Quite simply, the only way the U.S. will compete and outpace China, and to a lesser extent Russia's burgeoning influence in the region, is with a more attractive vision for our shared hemisphere. We should not shy away from the fact that this is a competition over ideology as much as it is about influence. Shared principles are critical to forging robust coalitions, and for the region, these shared principles and aspirations are anchored unequivocally in the Charter. Fourth, leverage the International Development Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank. Recognizing the importance of the region, the U.S. Congress ought to consider a requirement that 35% of DFC lending be pegged to the Americas, as the Bipartisan Advancing Competitiveness, Transparency, and Security in the America Act, ACSA, does. If paired with a much-needed capital increase at the IDB and with matched private financing, this could yield nearly $250 billion over a 5-year period. Some serious investment power to transform the region and limit China's One Belt, One Road initiative and its debilitating debt trap financing practices. And lastly, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to reconsider the relationship between trade agreements and democracy efforts. The U.S. should reconsider its free trade agreements with countries considered not free by Freedom House. In the region, this means reconsidering Nicaragua's continued participation in CAFTA DR. Quite simply, the U.S. has no interest in permitting free trade arrangements to bolster security apparatuses of authoritarian regimes accused of committing crimes against humanity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to answering the committee's questions.
Thank you both for your testimony. I appreciated some good insights there. I certainly am a big supporter of capitalizing up the IDB. I think can be a tremendous instrument in the hemisphere to both promote our collective interests and, of course, as a counterweight to China. I have one generic question, and then I have some country-specific questions. Ms. Solmer, well, for both of you, actually. So we're going to host the Summit of the Americas. Who gets invited? And I think it's important because, you know, who's seated at the table in the first instance? There are those who might argue it's a Summit of the Americas, so everybody in the Americas gets invited. By the same token, there are those who would argue, well, the Inter-American Democratic Charter, those who abide by it, get invited, and those who do not understand that they need to achieve that goal. There are other conditions that others may suggest. What is both of your views?
Thank you for the question. I would say it's important as the host of the summit that independent civil society organizations form part of this. Too many times, such as the Cuban Independent Civil Society, are clamoring to participate in multilateral forums, and it's important that we show our support to these groups and that they're part of the agenda, as has been in the past in Panama and Peru and other places. So in terms of who gets invited, I would say it's important to include independent civil society because they serve as a check on their own governments.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question, Senator. I think it's extremely important, as Ms. Ulmer mentioned in her oral statement, that we go big when it comes to the playing host of the summit. As the hosts, I think we have the ability to play a role in who gets invited and as to the invite list. However, I think it gets pretty hairy when it comes to deciding who it is that ought to be on that invite list, because I understand that even members of this committee would probably disagree as to who is and who isn't abiding by the Charter. And so if the question is, do we have the ability to play a role as to the invite list, I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Obviously, the devil's in the details there on who exactly is going to decide and by what metrics they're going to decide the invite list.
Well, it seems to me that what would be universal recognitions of violation, significant violation of human rights, dictatorships, and a series of other elements that certainly don't live up to the Democratic Charter. Because if everybody can come to the meeting and at the end of the day not live up to the obligations, well, there isn't any association, any membership, any organization. You can't be part of NATO unless you meet certain standards, right? So I would hope we think about that as well. I appreciate the civil society elements. Let me turn to some country-specific questions. This morning, the Foreign Relations Committee voted overwhelmingly to support my resolution expressing the Senate's support for Cuba's San Isidro movement. Since November, in a renewed wave of civic activists, artists, and others in Cuba have been calling for greater freedom of expression on the island. Not surprisingly, the Cuban regime has responded as all authoritarian governments do, with harassment, persecution, physical attacks, and in one case, the temporary suspension of internet service in the country to slow news of the protests. As the Cuban people demand a future of patria y vida, it's a long past time for the regime to make way for democratic aspirations of its own citizens. Ms. Olma, given your extensive experience working with democracy activists across the region, can you talk to us about the significance of the San Isidro movement, its unprecedented advances, the regime's ongoing response, and how can the international community best support Cuban artists and activists clamoring for change?
Thank you. As you said, recent peaceful protests by Cuban artists, journalists, civic activists calling for freedom of speech and cultural rights is the largest demonstrations on the island in the past 60 years. In this respect, the committee's strong bipartisan approval of the resolution in support of the San Isidro movement shines a key spotlight on human rights situation in Cuba and provides critical backing to Cuban activists. The first great advancement of San Isidro movement was to prevent the implementation of Decree 349, which would severely limit artistic freedoms. The San Isidro movement has awakened the desire by Cubans to enjoy the same freedoms and democratic rights as others throughout the hemisphere, including those who traditionally are not involved in promoting human rights and freedoms, including religious organizations and even some artists that have been perceived as being closer to the regime. One way to support Cuban activists, as I just said on the Summit of the Americas, is to invite them to the Summit of the Americas and other multilateral forums and calling on the Cuban regime to ensure that they can participate without fear of reprisal. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me ask one final question. In November, Nicaragua will hold presidential elections. In recent months, the Ortega government and its accomplices have passed a series of laws aimed at criminalizing political activity in the country and undermining prospects for a free, fair, and transparent election. Furthermore, continuous attacks against independent media outlets in the country and a wave of human rights abuses in the interior of the country show a regime intent on intimidating its citizens as an effort to predetermine the outcome in November. Tomorrow, I'll lead a new bipartisan legislation, the Reconsiderar Act, in the Senate that will send a clear signal about the Ortega regime's corrupt and human rights violations and define a coordinated international strategy for advancing democratic elections in Nicaragua. Can you both speak to us about the closing political space in Nicaragua and what type of steps the international community needs to take to avoid the rise of a third dictatorship in the hemisphere?
Thank you. The Nicaragua legislation, I'm sure, will be welcomed by many Nicaraguenses. While Nicaragua's ongoing social political crises started in April 2018, the closing political space did not begin in 2018. It began in 2008 with the municipal elections that were documented as the most fraudulent elections in Nicaragua's history. So this has been going on for more than a decade. 2018, however, marked a dark turning point in Nicaragua's history. It resulted in more than 325 deaths at the hands of the police and paramilitary, according to numerous human rights reports. The violent repression continues today. Daniel Ortega maintains his power through force, blackmail, and terror. This chain of repression begins in the communities with the military, with the police and paramilitary forces who monitor, harass, persecute citizens as they identify opponents, and continues with a corrupt judiciary that fabricates evidence against political opponents and imprisons without due process. These actors have illegally enriched themselves with the protection of the regime. That is why it's important for the United States to trace their assets hidden in shell corporations and apply corresponding sanctions. The United States should also support reformist social and political leaders who are genuinely committed to the recovery of democracy in their country and who seek to unify and contest the elections, which represents the best chance for Nicaraguans to regain their freedoms. It is essential that the United States press for minimum conditions for legitimate elections in Nicaragua, including 1, the full participation of the democratic opposition without restrictions, 2, transparency through national and international observers, and 3, accountability at all levels of the election process. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr.
Berg,
Chairman.
you have some comments, too?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thanks so much for the question on Nicaragua, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. I'm extremely concerned about what I call the authoritarian architecture, which the Ortega regime is currently constructing. In the last several months, starting in about September or October of last year, we saw a cascade of legislation going through the National Assembly. First, it was the Foreign Agents Law, meant to basically shut down civil society. I mentioned in my opening statement the concept of authoritarian export. That law looked very similar, almost a carbon copy to the 2012 bill that the Russians passed under Vladimir Putin to shut down civil society in that country. There was a cyber law as well, which establishes a new mechanism of offense as a way of silencing and chilling speech in the country. And then there was also the opposition, the law against the democratic opposition in the country, which basically makes it illegal for members of Nicaraguan society who have called for sanctions and pressure on the Ortega government to run for and hold office in Nicaragua. So all of these were paired with an increase in penalties as well, to include life sentences. And so the amount of pressure that the Ortega regime is wielding against the democratic opposition in the country is very immense. I think, as I mentioned in my opening statement, the U.S. needs to reconsider Cafta DR, which I think is the ultimate cudgel in any sort of push to get free and fair elections there. I think as well we need to consider sanctioning the Nicaraguan military. We've done the national police last year, but the military was also involved in some of the same human rights abuses for which the national police were sanctioned as well. There's a very lucrative investment fund that goes by the acronym IPSM, IPSM, which many of the high-level officials in the Nicaraguan military are involved in. I know that some of the assets are exposed to the New York Stock Exchange and other elements of the United States financial system. We should go after those. If they're still at risk, we should consider seizing them or sanctioning them. But when it comes to the democratic opposition, I think that we need to place an importance on a legitimate organizing process, primaries, a process out of which there will be consensus about the candidate to face Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo, because that's really the lesson for me from the 1990 elections that saw the election of Violeta Chamorro, was that there was a consensus that came out of a proper organizing process among the opposition.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, for you, Dr. Berg, last month, the Ortega regime proposed a measure to force Nicaraguan banks to do business with individuals facing economic sanctions. What impact does this have on Nicaragua's obligations under the Dominican Republic Central America Free Trade Agreement?
Thank you for the question, Senator. You're referring to the so-called consumer protection law, which essentially forces the 27 or so designated individuals on the OFAC list to be able to maintain a bank account within Nicaragua. And of course, the danger here is that Nicaragua's entire banking system could be shut out of international markets and the ability of Nicaraguans to both send and receive money if their connections to those corresponding banks in the United States is cut off because of this consumer protection law, which really operates as a sort of blocking mechanism on U.S. sanctions. And so the consequences here are grave. We all know the importance of remittances for quite a few countries in Central America, and if that connection has to be severed there to corresponding banks in the United States, it could create chaos within the Nicaraguan banking system.
Yeah, I think most of us are aware of the remittance issue, as you indicated, the huge part of the GDP that makes up of those countries. And I'm assuming that's going to cause some real difficulties in that regard. Is that a fair statement?
It would, Senator, yes.
Okay. Well, thank you. For both of you, I think you've touched on this, but if you could delve a little deeper maybe into what are the implications for the region and for the hemisphere if Ortega fraudulently extends his time in office after the November, by means of the November 2021 elections? What do you foresee there?
I'll take this one first, if it's okay with Ms. Ulmer. Look, I think that this is really the last chance that we have for something approaching free or freer and fairer elections in Nicaragua. Ms. Ulmer refers in her written statement to democratic deficits in Nicaragua. I would actually go a step further and say we're on the precipice of a consolidated dictatorship, as the chairman indicated in some of his remarks in Nicaragua. So this really is the last chance that we have for freer and fairer elections. We have to get our policy right. Obviously, of course, the opposition needs to do its thing on the ground. It needs to organize. It needs to have consensus and unity around a single candidate. But we need to do our part to make sure that there's political space in the country. But I can't emphasize enough, Senator, that this, in my opinion, is really our chance, our last chance, because a consolidated dictatorship, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is extremely difficult to break down and to rebuild a democracy out of that. And we're really on the precipice here in Nicaragua if we see another re-election of Daniel Ortega and his wife.
Yeah, Ms. Ulmer.
Thank you. I would agree with everything that Dr. Berg just said and add that the danger for the hemisphere is also the increased illiberal influences that have already established themselves in Nicaragua. The Russians, as you know, have built training, counter-narcotics training, and have rumored to have trained more than 500 officials in Central America. It mirrors U.S. training for counter-narcotics in the Northern Triangle. They also have satellites based in Nicaragua that are rumored to be spying on the opposition and who knows who else in the hemisphere. I would say that's the real danger. Not only is it harder to roll back, as we've seen in Venezuela, but we have some real illiberal influences on our back door.
Thank you much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Cardin.
Let me thank both of our witnesses for your testimony. And you just underscore the point about our need to pay attention to good governance issues. You mentioned transparency. You mentioned some of the statutes that we've done in regards to money laundering. And it's when you look at our hemisphere and the challenges that we confront in our hemisphere, we have a greater tradition of democratic governments, but we are very much compromised by systemic corruption that exists in so many countries that call themselves democratic countries and may have even free and fair elections that qualify as free and fair elections, but they're being challenged today because of the failure to confront corruption, which has led to drug trafficking, which has led to all the other issues that we're talking about today. And yes, you mentioned one issue in regards to money laundering, which I would agree with you, the statutes that we've tried to confront with shell corporations, very important, but we need to take a much more holistic approach. And that's why Senator Young and I introduced legislation that this committee acted on in the last Congress that did not get to the finish line, that would establish a process to evaluate how well countries are on a path to dealing with corruption in a way similar to how we evaluate trafficking in persons, using a similar mechanism, so that we have a common standard to put a spotlight on countries on what they need to do in order to make progress. Now, The Biden administration is talking about major investments in our hemisphere. I support that. But those investments must be founded in our values, and President Biden's been strong about this, but one of those values need to be to have a commitment, a political commitment of the leaders to deal with corruption, not to dismantle the anti-corruption mechanisms in your country, but to strengthen that and to have an independent judiciary and to have laws against laundering money and to have anti-bribery statutes. All that needs to be part of a commitment, and the United States must be in the leadership to put a focus on that. So let me just get each of your comments as to how we can really showcase U.S. leadership that can allow us to show regional leadership with commitments to fight corruption.
It's okay by Dr. Berg. I'll take this one first then. In the Northern Triangle, where we see entrenched elite corruption that are being enriched by networks of narco-traffickers, of human traffickers, we need to see the commitment of the leaders, but also actions. And while we've been working with governments in the past, we need to pay more attention in working with reformers both inside but also outside of government. And the good news is that there have been reformist legislators, former attorney generals, bodies that have been left and established by CICIG in Guatemala or a MAXI in Honduras. And there are those individuals who have been trained and have reform-minded values that can be supported going forward. Civil society is also forming larger networks, both at the sub-regional and national levels, to support one another. And these networks include investigative journalists, they include civil society, human rights, and anti-corruption watchdogs. It's important that the United States show commitment and support not only to the government, but also to those reformists that are on outside of the government trying to rescue their democracy from narco-traffickers.
Dr. Berg.
Thank you for the question, Senator, and thank you as well for the legislation requiring open reporting, transparency, also a progress report on this very important issue. I love pieces of legislation that use some of the best tools of free societies to help other free societies. I'm just going to say it. We have some really difficult partners in the region. And as Ms. Ulmer mentioned, leadership is extremely necessary. And if you don't have reformers on the ground, we are limited in what we are able to do. And one thing I want to mention here, which otherwise might not get mentioned, is that I'm extremely concerned about Mexico, for example, and about the progress in that country when it comes to money laundering concerns. The gulf between what the leadership of someone like Andrés Manuel López Obrador promised and what it's actually delivering, I think there's a delta between that. There's a big opportunity here for this administration to push the AMLO administration towards its rhetorical goals, which is this fourth transformation, this final separation between economic and political power in Mexico and how money laundering and corruption is intertwined there is extremely important, but there's incredible blind spots in this administration that need to be pressured, I think, from the United States. Another thing I would highlight is the prosecution of malefactors. We need to make sure that folks that are using specifically our financial system and also the financial systems of the region face penalties. As was mentioned by the Secretary General previously, there is a very large amount of impunity in many countries throughout the region, many times above 90%. There's asymmetrical tools that we can bring to the fore as well. We've talked about sanctions and the activity of OFAC. There was also the Engel list that was passed late last year, which will be another tool for naming and shaming and blocking travel. But this is incredibly technical work, as Ms. Ulmer mentioned. You have to work with attorneys general, you have to work with civil society on the ground, and it's not the big sort of visionary stuff. It's highly technical, but it's really, in many ways, what makes the difference for the quality of life and the quality of democracy in the region.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Kane, and may I ask you, Senator Kane, to close out our hearing? I have an immigration hearing, a meeting that I need to go to, so if you would do that.
Absolutely.
You're
Thank
the
you.
last member to be recognized unless Senator Risch has more questions. Okay.
Great. Thank you to all. And there's also a vote on the floor, so
yes,
you'll see us race off.
Senator Kane, I'm sorry, I misspoke. I understand Senator Van Hollen is available virtually, so after you, if you would recognize him.
Oh, I will.
No, thank you.
I'm going to just ask two questions, and I'll let one of you tackle one and one of you tackle the other. So here are my two questions. One, what can we do to promote more press freedom in the region? The Reporters Without Borders say that Mexico and Honduras are two of the top 4 nations in the world in the number of journalists killed. So we're not even talking censorship or imprisonment. We're talking the murder of journalists. And there are other nations in the hemisphere that have significant challenges as well. So what can we do from the vantage point of this committee or the Senate to promote press freedom in the region? And the second, I'll make a self-critical point, and it's this. This is my region of the world that I'm most interested in. I love being on this committee for that reason. But I find myself almost always talking about North America, Central America, South America, and seldom about the Caribbean. And I'll just be self-critical about that. I don't really focus on Caribbean issues. Of course, we've had many discussions about Cuba, but other than that, we don't do an awful lot in the committee about the Caribbean. And so maybe one of you could address what we could do to promote press freedom in the region, and the other maybe could address what are some opportunities that we might have on relationship building in the Caribbean.
Sure. So for press freedom, protection of journalists. I would say protection of all reform-minded persons working within government and outside of government is really, number one, to ensure that they are safe in what they're doing. That includes providing security training, providing cyber security training, and unfortunately sometimes protecting them as witnesses as they're trying to get their information out. Many times the journalists will now pair up with international journalists on important corruption events to protect their lives, so that's important. And another area to work on with press freedom is the disinformation. As you know, there's a prevalence of disinformation. And so nowadays, NDI and other organizations like ours are working with electoral authorities and other government officials with Facebook, with Microsoft, with Twitter on how to detect disinformation and to combat it. Specifically, we've been dealing with disinformation against violence against women political candidates in countries like Colombia, Mexico, Ecuador, and El Salvador. So I think those are important initiatives. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Ms. Ulmer. And on the Caribbean, how about some ideas?
Yes, thank you, Senator, very much for the question on the Caribbean. I think this goes back to what I said in my opening statement about vision. Sometimes the Charter has failed to play that wider visionary role that we hoped it would play, and I hope that the United States government and this administration will think about the Caribbean as an integral part of this community, because I agree with you 100%, Senator. I'm someone who works on these issues every day, and I too oftentimes find myself neglecting the Caribbean from time to time. I think there's an opportunity for us to roll out a Caribbean basin type program, a serious engagement with the region, a capital infusion in DFC, and rather a 35% requirement for DFC to lend to the Americas, as well as a capital infusion in the Inter-American Development Bank, could beef up our support and engagement in the region. But whenever I meet with Caribbean members of the Caribbean diaspora and also Caribbean delegations here in Washington, there's a real thirst for more U.S. engagement. I think they do feel that neglect that I mentioned as not being fully part of the region, which of course they absolutely are. And I'm also
and just parenthetically, then that can create challenges, because when we go to Caribbean nations to talk about, hey, can you support us dealing with Venezuelan sanctions or something like that, if they feel like we've kind of left them out of a dialogue, and we're normally not paying attention to the Americas anyway, but if we pay even less attention in the Caribbean, then when we go with an ask, I mean, it's a lot harder to get an answer that we like.
That's right, Senator. So I think, one last thing I was going to say is I'm very thankful that the Secretary General mentioned the Caribbean as our third border. I believe that's the language that he used about it, and I hope that the administration will begin to think about vaccines as a critical form of our engagement. Again, this is not only a matter of soft power and influence, but it's also a matter of public health and public safety.
Thank you very much for both, and I now recognize by Senate WebEx Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator Kaine, and thank you to both our witnesses. And let me just start by saying I share the concerns that were raised and expressed about the situation in Venezuela, situation in Nicaragua, with both those regimes. My question relates to the largest democracy in Latin America, Brazil. And some of the threats we've seen to democratic and independent institutions in the country from President Bolsonaro. And I wanted to see if you would comment on what you think about the stresses being placed on democracy in Brazil, and whether the United States should be doing something about it. Why don't we start with Ms. Ulmer?
Thank you, Senator. It is concerning what is happening in Brazil, and particularly the rhetoric. Brazil, as you know, represents one of the largest democracies in the hemisphere. And the rule of law, protection of the environment with the Amazons, and now even with COVID-19 and restrictions that have been placed on the population and then lifted rapidly, and disinformation surrounding COVID in Brazil are all concerning. Democracy is fragile in Latin America, and when you have the largest democracies backslide and their future looking grim, these are very concerning trends. And the U.S. should probably focus more in helping look to issues of democratic governance in terms of the environment and other issues that affect the hemisphere and engage in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Berg, do you share those concerns?
Thank you for the question about Brazil, Senator. I have watched as a Brazil expert and also a person who spent more than 2 years of my life living in the wonderful country of Brazil. I spend a lot of my time watching the country, paying attention to President Jair Bolsonaro and what he's doing. I think that there are, on some levels, threats to the democratic institutions in the country, but in my opening remarks, I sketched out or adumbrated what I thought were consolidated democracies, backsliding and straining democracies, highly imperfect democracies, and consolidated dictatorships in the region. And I will note that Brazil falls somewhere between the consolidated democracies and backsliding democracies. But I, for one, think that Brazil has incredibly strong institutions. And I will point you to the anti-corruption investigation called Operation Lava Jato or Operation Car Wash, which actually led to or contributed quite a bit to the electoral environment, which gave us a president like Jair Bolsonaro, as an example of the way in which institutions in Brazil are incredibly strong. Compare that, for example, to Central America, where there was an exogenous imposition of an anti-corruption body like the CICIG. Brazil was able to do this domestically with its institutions a very wide-ranging anti-corruption probe, which brought more than 200 high-level individuals in the political sphere to trial for systemic corruption. So I think that there is an element to this where Brazil's institutions are quite strong, even if they're being strained. In terms of our relationship with Brazil, I think we need to widen the aperture of our engagement. I think major non-NATO ally status, which was accorded to Brazil in 2019, is a major opportunity for us to engage on the defense cooperation level. But if you're looking for areas of leverage, Senator, to be able to nudge the Bolsonaro administration into more democratic and productive directions, look, Brazil is always looking for its